Imagine yourself deep in an ancient forest, where the silence feels like it's watching you. The darkness creeps in, and with each step, you awaken something that was never meant to be found. What begins as a simple hunting trip quickly turns into a nightmare, as three men are stalked by a creature beyond human comprehension. And the forest itself? It's shifting, changing, trapping them. In this story full of terror and suspense, you'll follow Mark, John, and Tom as they fight not only a relentless monster, but also a wilderness that twists against them. The fear grows with every moment, until running is no longer an option. If you love stories that make your heart race, subscribe to the channel now, give a like to support us, and share this chilling experience with your friends. Let's dive together into the darkness and find out what happens when the forest becomes the hunter. The moose that didn't flee. The early morning light filtered weakly through the dense canopy of trees, casting long, ghostly shadows across the forest floor. Mark Johnson, a seasoned hunter in his mid-40s, moved silently through the underbrush, every step deliberate. The forest in Tongass, Alaska, was unlike any he had hunted in before, wild, untamed, and vast, stretching as far as the eye could see. Normally, he thrived in these conditions. The isolation was a welcome escape from the noise of modern life. But today, something felt wrong. Mark paused for a moment, wiping the frost from his beard, and listened. The forest was silent, unnervingly so. No birds calling, no rustle of small creatures scurrying through the underbrush. Just the sound of his own breathing and the occasional creak of trees bending in the wind. His breath condensed in the cold air, hanging in front of him like smoke, before quickly dissipating. He glanced around, eyes sharp and calculating, looking for any sign of movement. It was the silence that unsettled him the most. Tongass was known for its wildlife, but today it felt devoid of life, almost as if the forest itself was holding its breath. He had been tracking a moose for hours, following faint prints in the fresh snow, broken branches, and occasional tufts of fur snagged on low-hanging branches. The signs told him the moose was close. He could almost sense it. Slowly, methodically, Mark continued through the trees, his rifle slung over his shoulder, the weight of it familiar and reassuring. Then, as if out of nowhere, he saw it. A massive bull moose stood motionless in a small clearing ahead, its broad antlers rising like twisted branches into the gray sky. Mark crouched instinctively, lowering his body into the underbrush, his hunter's instincts kicking in. He watched the animal for a few moments, observing its posture. It wasn't grazing or moving. It just stood there, utterly still, as though frozen in time. Mark adjusted his position, raising his rifle and steadying it against a nearby tree trunk. Through the scope, he could see the moose more clearly now, its fur thick and matted, steam rising gently from its nostrils in the cold air. Its eyes, however, were strange. They didn't have the wild, alert look he was used to seeing in animals. Instead, they were dark, almost glassy, like two bottomless pits that reflected nothing. Mark frowned but shook off the unease gnawing at his gut. A quick, clean shot, he told himself. That's all it takes. He held his breath, lined up the crosshairs on the moose's side, and squeezed the trigger. The crack of the rifle echoed through the forest, shattering the oppressive silence. The bullet hit its mark, striking the moose squarely in the flank. But what happened next froze Mark in place. The moose didn't flinch. It didn't stagger, didn't bolt, didn't collapse in a heap like every other animal Mark had hunted before. It stood there, as if the bullet hadn't even touched it. The forest around them seemed to grow even quieter, as if waiting for something. Mark's pulse quickened. He lowered his rifle slightly, confused, his eyes fixed on the moose. Slowly, agonizingly slow, the moose turned its head toward him. The movement was unnatural, jerky, like a poorly wound puppet. Mark could hear the faint popping and cracking of joints as the moose's neck twisted further than it should have, until its dead, black eyes were locked onto him. Mark felt a chill run through his body, settling deep in his bones. He had been hunting for over 2 decades, seen animals react to pain, fear, instinct. But this was different. There was no fear in those eyes, no pain, no recognition of the wound that had just been inflicted. It was as if the moose was something else entirely, wearing a skin that no longer fit. For a moment, neither moved. The only sound was the distant whistle of the wind high in the trees. Then, Mark saw it, the blood. At first, it was just a trickle, a single line of dark liquid running from the entry wound. But it wasn't right. The blood was too thick, too dark, almost black. It oozed, slow and viscous, pooling at the moose's side before dribbling to the ground in sluggish drops. Mark stared in disbelief as the blood began to move, not downward as gravity should pull it, but sideways, as though it were being drawn towards something in the trees. Mark blinked. His breath caught in his throat as he took a step back, his eyes following the thick, tar-like substance as it snaked across the snow. It didn't soak into the earth. Instead, it crept, inching its way along the surface, defying every law of nature he understood. He swallowed hard, his pulse hammering in his ears. He should run. Every instinct screamed at him to turn and get as far away from this place as possible. But his legs felt like lead, rooted to the spot. He could only watch as the moose took a single, deliberate step forward. Its hooves crunched on the snow with a sound that sent a jolt of unease through him. It wasn't a natural sound. It was hollow, metallic, like something far heavier than the animal itself was stomping on the frozen earth. The moose tilted its head slightly, almost as if it were considering him. Mark's hands trembled, gripping his rifle tighter. His breath quickened. This wasn't right. None of this was right. Suddenly, the moose turned, its movements still slow and jerky, and began to walk deeper into the trees. Mark stood frozen, staring at the strange black trail it left behind. The thick blood smeared across the snow didn't just vanish into the ground, it began to climb. Long tendrils of the liquid rose up the trunks of the trees, slithering toward the branches above like something alive. Mark's heart thudded in his chest. He forced himself to take a step back, then another. He had seen enough. Whatever this was, it wasn't something he wanted to understand. He had to leave. Now. Just as he turned to go, he heard something. A faint sound, just beyond the tree line. It was soft at first, almost like the wind. But it wasn't the wind. It was something else, something moving through the underbrush, slow, deliberate. Something following him. Mark's breath hitched in his throat as he started to move faster, the eerie silence of the forest amplifying the crunch of his footsteps. His heart raced. He didn't look back. He couldn't. Whatever was out there, he didn't want to see it. Mark's breaths came in ragged gasps as he pushed through the dense forest, the cold air burning in his lungs. Every step felt heavier, as though the weight of the forest itself was pressing down on him, slowing him, urging him to stop. But the fear, the growing, primal terror, kept him moving. He wasn't alone out here. The trees towered above him like silent sentinels, their branches twisting together into a dark, impenetrable canopy that blocked out much of the pale light. The path back to camp should have been clear. He was an experienced hunter, trained to track even in the most remote terrain, but now everything looked the same. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, an unbroken wall of shadows and mist. But the trail, that trail of black, oozing blood, it hadn't disappeared. If anything, it was more present now, weaving between the trunks, climbing higher into the trees like some kind of dark vine. Mark's eyes followed it, disbelief gnawing at him with each step. The way the blood moved defied explanation. It wasn't behaving naturally, not flowing with gravity. It was crawling, slithering upward, almost as if the trees themselves were feeding on it. Mark stopped, his heart pounding, and leaned against a tree to catch his breath. His muscles ached, but it wasn't just physical exhaustion that weighed him down. Something was deeply wrong with this place. He had hunted in these woods before, and they had always felt alive in a peaceful, grounding way. But now, they felt alive in a different sense, something darker, more sinister. It was as if the forest was watching him, waiting for him to slip. The rustling came again. Mark stiffened. His head snapped up, eyes darting around. There it was, that sound again. Something moving through the trees above him. His fingers tightened on the rifle slung across his chest as he scanned the canopy, searching for any sign of movement. But all he saw were the thick, intertwined branches swaying lightly in the breeze. He knew something was up there, though. He had seen it before, just a flicker of movement, something large and fast, too big for a bird or squirrel, but too silent for anything else. "Get a grip, Mark," he whispered to himself, his voice shaky. "It's just the woods. You've been in worse places." But even as he said it, he didn't believe it. Not this time. With trembling hands, he adjusted his rifle and started moving again, trying to push the fear out of his mind. He needed to find John and Tom, his hunting partners. They had split up earlier in the day to cover more ground, but he knew they couldn't be far. If he could just find them, maybe they could figure out what the hell was going on. Mark glanced over his shoulder, his paranoia spiking. The forest behind him seemed to stretch endlessly, the shadows deepening the farther back he looked. The black blood still crawled up the trees, and it felt like it was following him, even though he knew that was impossible. But then again, everything about today had been impossible. He quickened his pace. But after a few minutes, something strange happened. The air around him felt thicker, heavier. It was subtle at first, but soon he noticed that every breath he took felt more labored, like the air had become denser. He stopped, confused, and looked around. That's when he saw it. The trees had shifted. The trail that should have led him back toward camp was gone, swallowed by the forest. Mark's throat tightened as he realized the trees around him weren't where they should have been. He had been walking in a straight line, but now it was as though the forest had rearranged itself behind his back, shifting into a new configuration without him noticing. A cold sweat broke out across his forehead as he turned in circles, trying to find something familiar. But there was nothing. Every direction looked the same, endless rows of dark trunks stretching into the mist, the ground blanketed by untouched snow. It was as though the forest was playing with him, deliberately disorienting him. He looked down at the snow, hoping to see his own footprints. But they were gone. The trail he had made just moments ago had vanished, as if it had never existed. Mark's breath caught in his throat. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. He couldn't be lost. He knew these woods. But it didn't matter what he knew, not anymore. The forest had changed, and he was no longer in control. The rustling sound came again, louder this time. Closer. Mark gripped his rifle tightly, his pulse spiking. The noise wasn't just above him anymore, it was all around him, circling, as if something was moving through the trees, stalking him. His eyes darted back and forth, desperately trying to find the source of the sound, but the shadows shifted with the wind, obscuring everything. He took a step back, heart hammering in his chest. Then another. And another. The sound grew louder, more insistent, and Mark's skin prickled with fear. Whatever was out there wasn't just an animal. It was intelligent. It was hunting him. Mark backed into a tree, and the cold bark pressed into his spine, grounding him for just a moment. He raised the rifle to his shoulder, aiming into the darkness. "Show yourself," he shouted, his voice raw and shaky. "Come on." The forest remained silent. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Mark saw something move. It was quick, a dark blur between the trees, low to the ground but impossibly fast. His pulse quickened, and he swung the rifle in its direction, finger tightening on the trigger. But before he could fire, it was gone, slipping back into the shadows as if it had never been there. Mark's breath came in short bursts now, panic threatening to overtake him. He was being toyed with, stalked by something he couldn't see, couldn't predict. He took another step back, his boots crunching in the snow, and then he froze. Behind him, deep in the forest, came a low, guttural growl. The sound vibrated through the air, rumbling like thunder, deep and primal. It sent a shock of fear straight to Mark's core, freezing him in place. He had heard growls before, bears, wolves, but this was different. This wasn't the sound of a predator defending its territory. This was the sound of something that had already decided its prey. Mark swallowed hard, every muscle in his body tensing as the growl grew louder, more menacing. His eyes darted through the trees, scanning for any sign of movement. His mind screamed at him to run, but his legs wouldn't respond. He was trapped. Suddenly, the growl stopped, replaced by an eerie, suffocating silence. Mark's throat tightened, and the oppressive stillness pressed in around him like a heavy blanket. He knew that whatever was out there hadn't gone far. It was waiting. Watching. And it wasn't going to stop until it got what it wanted. With a shaky breath, Mark slowly turned, trying to retrace his steps. He had to find John and Tom, had to warn them. They needed to get out of here before it was too late. But as he started walking again, he realized something horrifying. The trail of blood had returned, winding through the trees ahead of him, leading him deeper into the woods. Only this time, it wasn't just climbing the trunks. It was dripping from the branches above, staining the leaves and snow in dark, unnatural patterns. It was as if the forest itself was bleeding. Mark's heart raced as he pressed on, the feeling of being hunted never leaving him. He didn't know what was out there, or why it was stalking him, but one thing was clear, it wasn't going to let him go. And as the growl echoed once more through the trees, Mark knew he was running out of time. The forest felt colder now, heavier, as if the very air had thickened, making every breath Mark took feel labored and shallow. His boots crunched through the snow as he pushed deeper into the woods, his eyes scanning frantically for any sign of his hunting partners. He needed to find John and Tom. They had split up earlier in the day to cover more ground, but something was wrong, terribly wrong, and the thought of them alone out here sent a new wave of fear through him. Mark had tried calling out for them, but his voice felt swallowed by the dense trees. It was as if the forest itself had conspired to muffle his shouts, absorbing the sound before it could carry any real distance. Worse, each time he called, there was always a lingering silence after, unnaturally quiet, almost as though the trees were listening. Watching. He quickened his pace, trying to ignore the unnerving thought. His mind kept replaying the image of the black blood, oozing and slithering up the trees, defying gravity, as though the forest itself were bleeding. And the growl, that low, guttural rumble that had shaken him to his core, kept echoing in his memory. "John! Tom!" he shouted, his voice cracking slightly from the cold and fear. His breath came out in thick clouds of mist, dissipating quickly in the still air. Then, finally, a response. Faint, but there. "Mark!" It was John's voice, rough but familiar, cutting through the thick silence. Mark's heart leapt in his chest as he sprinted toward the sound. Relief washed over him, but it was quickly overshadowed by a new sense of urgency. They needed to get out of these woods, immediately. Bursting through a thick patch of trees, Mark spotted John and Tom huddled near a small clearing. They looked on edge, their rifles drawn, eyes scanning the surrounding forest much like his had been. Tom, John's son, stood a little behind his father, his face pale and tense. Both men turned toward him as he approached. "Mark," John called out again, his voice gruff but relieved. "Thank God. Where the hell have you been?" Mark slowed to a stop in front of them, panting heavily. He shook his head, unable to fully explain what he had seen, what he was still trying to comprehend. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," he muttered, glancing over his shoulder, half expecting the black blood to be snaking through the trees behind him. John frowned, his brow furrowed with concern. "We've been hearing strange noises all day. Something's wrong with these woods." His eyes shifted to the treeline, where shadows loomed darker than they should have. "We tried tracking a deer earlier, but we lost its trail. We thought it was nothing at first, but..." He trailed off, looking uneasy. "I shot a moose," Mark said abruptly, cutting in. "A big bull. Perfect shot. It didn't move. It just stood there." Tom's eyebrows shot up. What do you mean it didn't move? Mark wiped a cold sweat from his brow, feeling the weight of his words. I hit it dead on, but it just stood there like nothing happened. And then... He hesitated, unsure of how to explain the black blood, the way it crawled up the trees. There was something wrong with it. Its blood wasn't right. It was thick, black, like oil. And then something started following me. Tom exchanged a nervous glance with his father, his hand tightening on his rifle. What do you mean something? Mark took a deep breath, his eyes darting between the two men. I don't know what it was, but it wasn't an animal I've ever seen. It was big, fast, and it's out there, watching us. John narrowed his eyes, clearly trying to process what Mark was saying. He had hunted these woods for years, but nothing like this had ever happened before. You sure it's not just a bear? Mark shook his head. It's not a bear. It's something else. John opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, a distant sound interrupted him. The same growl Mark had heard before, a deep, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate through the air, echoed through the trees. All three men froze, their eyes widening as they listened. The growl came again, louder this time, and with it came the unmistakable sound of movement, something large, crashing through the underbrush, but moving with an unsettling fluidity. John's grip on his rifle tightened. What the hell is that? He muttered, his voice low. Mark didn't answer. He didn't need to. The fear in their eyes told him that they were all thinking the same thing. Whatever was out there wasn't a bear, wasn't a deer. It was something else, something that didn't belong. Tom glanced around nervously, his voice shaky. Should we run? No, Mark said quickly, shaking his head. It's too fast. We have to be smart about this. Stay together, move slowly. Whatever it is, it's hunting us. The growling grew louder, more guttural, and then, silence. The sudden absence of sound was worse than the growl itself. Mark's skin prickled, and the three men stood frozen in place, waiting for the next move. Then, without warning, the shadows between the trees shifted. Something dark and massive darted between the trunks, too fast for any of them to get a good look. Tom gasped, taking a step back, his eyes wide with panic. Did you see that? He whispered urgently. What the hell was that? I saw it, John said, his voice steady but laced with tension. But I still don't know what we're dealing with. Mark took a cautious step forward, his rifle raised. His hands were shaking, but he forced himself to stay calm. We need to get back to camp. Now. They began to move, staying close together, their rifles at the ready. The forest around them seemed to close in, the trees bending and twisting as if they were alive, watching their every move. The mist thickened, curling around their legs like fingers, and the shadows danced between the branches, always just out of sight. But the feeling of being hunted never left them. It pressed in on their minds, a constant, suffocating presence. They didn't speak as they moved through the trees, their footsteps soft but deliberate. Every sound, every creak of a branch or whisper of the wind, set their nerves on edge. The forest seemed to grow darker the farther they went, the sky above barely visible through the dense canopy. And then, from behind them, the growl returned, closer this time. Much closer. Mark spun around, his rifle ready, his heart hammering in his chest. John and Tom did the same, their eyes wide with fear. But the shadows between the trees remained still, the forest holding its breath. The growl came again, a deep, bone-chilling sound that vibrated through the earth beneath their feet. Stay together, Mark whispered, his voice tight with fear. It's close. But before they could take another step, something burst from the shadows. A blur of movement, massive and dark, hurtled toward them with terrifying speed. Mark barely had time to raise his rifle before the creature was upon them. The creature exploded from the shadows with a speed and force that none of them were prepared for. Mark barely had time to raise his rifle before the dark mass hurtled toward them, its form an indistinct blur of fur, antlers, and something else, something grotesquely wrong. Get down! Mark shouted, his voice cracking with panic as he fired off a shot. The rifle's crack echoed through the trees, but the creature was too fast. It twisted mid-leap, avoiding the bullet with an unnatural grace that no animal should have. John and Tom scrambled backward, their eyes wide with terror as the thing crashed into the snow where they had been standing just moments before. The force of its landing sent snow flying in every direction, and for the first time, they got a glimpse of what was hunting them. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything they could have imagined. The creature stood tall, its hulking body a grotesque fusion of animal and something human. Long, twisted antlers jutted from its head, but its body was wrong, warped. Its back was hunched, covered in matted fur, but its limbs were elongated, almost like a person crawling on all fours, but with grotesque, distorted proportions. Its eyes, red, glowing, locked onto Mark with a terrifying intelligence. "Jesus Christ," Tom whispered, frozen in place, his rifle hanging limp in his hands. Mark's heart pounded in his chest, the sight of the creature sending waves of icy dread through his body. This wasn't something natural. It was like nothing he had ever seen or even heard of. And those eyes, there was something behind them. A hunger, yes, but something more, something that felt like it was looking through him, into him. John fired his rifle, the shot breaking the momentary paralysis. The bullet struck the creature in the shoulder, causing it to let out a deep, guttural roar that vibrated through the air. But instead of fleeing or falling, it turned toward John with a snarl, as if the wound only enraged it further. "Move! Move!" Mark shouted, grabbing Tom by the shoulder and pulling him back as the creature lunged at John. John sidestepped just in time, the creature's massive claws swiping through the air where he had been standing. Mark's instincts took over, and he fired again, this time hitting the creature in the chest. The impact knocked it back a few steps, and black, tar-like blood began to ooze from the wound. The blood, it was the same black fluid that Mark had seen on the moose. The thick, unnatural liquid that seemed to defy the laws of nature. "John, fall back!" Mark yelled, his voice hoarse. "We need to regroup." John staggered back, his breathing heavy, his face pale as he tried to process what was happening. Tom finally snapped out of his paralysis, raising his rifle and firing off a shot that went wide, barely grazing the creature. The beast snarled, its red eyes glowing brighter, almost as if it was feeding off their fear. "It's not stopping!" Tom shouted, panic rising in his voice as he struggled to reload his rifle. "We've got to keep moving," Mark said, his mind racing. "Don't let it pin us down. If we're quick, we can." Before he could finish, the creature lunged again, its claws outstretched. It moved faster than any animal they had ever seen, its massive form barreling toward them like a freight train. Mark fired again, but the shot barely slowed it down. The creature slammed into a tree, its antlers splintering the trunk as it twisted in midair, landing with terrifying precision just feet away from them. John, gritting his teeth, fired at point-blank range. This time, the bullet struck the creature in the neck, and it let out a deafening roar of pain. Black blood sprayed across the snow, steaming in the cold air, but even that didn't stop it. The wound oozed, but the creature kept moving, as if it felt no pain. "We can't kill this thing!" Tom screamed, his voice desperate. "What is it?" "I don't know," Mark said, his voice tight, "but we're not sticking around to find out." He grabbed Tom's arm and yanked him back as the creature swiped again, its claws narrowly missing. The three of them bolted into the trees, running as fast as they could, their breath coming in ragged bursts, the adrenaline surging through their veins. But as they ran, the forest seemed to shift around them. The trees loomed larger, the shadows darker, and the once familiar terrain now felt alien. Mark's pulse spiked with every step. It was like the forest itself was bending, warping to trap them, just as it had earlier when he had tried to escape on his own. Behind them, the creature's heavy footsteps thudded through the snow, always just a few paces behind, its glowing red eyes burning through the darkness. Mark glanced back, his stomach churning as he saw it gaining ground, undeterred by its wounds. They couldn't outrun it. Not for long. "Up ahead!" John shouted, pointing to a small rocky outcrop that jutted out of the ground, a natural barricade of stone and trees. We can use that for cover. Mark nodded, his breath ragged as they raced toward the outcrop. The creature snarled behind them, its growls turning into a low, guttural rumble that sent shivers down Mark's spine. They reached the outcrop just in time. Mark dove behind a large rock, John and Tom following suit, their backs pressed against the cold stone as they struggled to catch their breath. For a moment, the only sound was the rapid thudding of their hearts and the faint rustle of wind through the trees. Mark peeked out from behind the rock, his rifle ready, but the creature was nowhere to be seen. The forest was still, eerily so, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. "Where did it go?" Tom whispered, his voice shaking. "Did we lose it?" John shook his head, his eyes wide with fear. "No way. It's still out there." Mark knew John was right. The creature was close. It was watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But it was too intelligent to attack head-on now. It had been wounded, and it was learning, adapting. "We can't stay here," Mark whispered, his mind racing. "It'll pick us off if we wait. We need to get back to camp and regroup, find a way to." A sudden crash interrupted him as the creature emerged from the tree-line, barreling toward them again, faster than before. Its red eyes glowed like fire, and its body, though wounded, moved with terrifying speed. Mark barely had time to react. He fired a shot, but the creature dodged it effortlessly, its claws raking across the ground as it closed in. They had to make a stand. Now. The group huddled behind the rocky outcrop, their breaths coming in ragged, uneven gasps. Mark's heart was pounding so loudly in his ears that it drowned out everything else, the wind, the creaking of the trees, and even the growling of the creature that had just narrowly missed them. His hands shook as he reloaded his rifle, sweat dripping down the back of his neck despite the freezing cold air. The last few minutes had been pure chaos, and they had barely escaped with their lives. The creature had retreated into the shadows of the forest, but Mark knew it wasn't gone. It was watching them. Waiting. "We need to get back to camp," John muttered, his voice low but tense. His eyes flicked nervously between the trees. "Whatever that thing is, it's going to come for us again." Tom, still pale from the encounter, nodded silently. His hands were shaking as he clutched his rifle, the reality of their situation finally sinking in. "It doesn't matter how fast we run," he said in a hushed voice. "It's faster. We can't outrun it." Mark glanced at them both, his mind racing for a solution. He knew Tom was right. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't just an animal. It was something far more intelligent, something that hunted with a patience and purpose he had never encountered before. "We can't outrun it," Mark said, his voice grim. "But we can't stay out here either. We have to get back to camp, regroup, and figure out what we're dealing with." They moved cautiously through the forest, sticking close together. The sky was growing darker, and the oppressive feeling of the forest seemed to deepen as night fell. The mist that had been swirling around the trees all day now clung low to the ground, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. They arrived back at camp just as the last light of day faded completely, plunging the forest into shadow. The small clearing they had set up camp in felt exposed now, vulnerable. The once peaceful sound of the crackling fire that still smoldered in the center of the camp only heightened the eerie silence that pressed in from the surrounding woods. Mark crouched by the fire and fed it a few sticks, coaxing the flames back to life. The flickering light illuminated the tense faces of his companions. "We'll take shifts. One of us will always be watching," Mark said, his voice steady, though inside he was struggling to keep calm. "Keep your rifles ready. We're not letting it catch us off guard." John sat down beside his son, gripping his rifle tightly. "You think it'll come back tonight?" "It's been following us this long," Mark muttered. "I don't think it's just going to give up." Tom, staring into the fire, didn't say anything. His hands were trembling, and his mind seemed far away, reliving the horror of the encounter. Mark knew how he felt. The image of that creature, its glowing red eyes, its grotesque, twisted form, was burned into his mind. They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling softly, casting long, dancing shadows around them. The forest seemed to be holding its breath, the wind barely rustling the trees, and the oppressive quiet was only broken by the occasional crack of a branch in the distance. Every sound made them jump, their nerves on edge. Mark took the first watch. He crouched at the edge of the camp, his rifle resting in his lap, eyes fixed on the dark tree-line just beyond the reach of the firelight. The shadows out there seemed to shift and move, and every now and then, he swore he could see something, a dark shape, a flicker of movement, but when he blinked, it was gone. The minutes dragged on, and Mark's mind raced with questions. What was that thing? Why was it hunting them? And why did the forest itself seem to be conspiring against them, shifting and changing like some living, breathing entity? The black blood, the twisted trees, the way the paths seemed to disappear and reappear, it was as if the land itself was warping, bending to the creature's will. As the hours passed, the fire began to dwindle again, casting weaker light. Mark threw another log onto it, but his eyes never left the tree-line. He could feel it now, the presence out there, watching them from the dark. It was closer than before. He could feel its eyes on him, glowing red in the distance, but just out of sight. Suddenly, there was a sound. A snap, sharp and deliberate, like a footstep crushing a branch. Mark shot to his feet, raising his rifle and training it on the dark trees just beyond the firelight. His heart pounded in his chest, and his breath came in short, shallow bursts. He squinted into the shadows, but the darkness was thick, impenetrable. "John. Tom. Get up," he whispered urgently, his voice barely more than a breath. John stirred quickly, grabbing his rifle and moving to Mark's side, his eyes wide with fear. Tom followed suit, his movements slower, as though the fear had weighed him down. They stood together, rifles raised, eyes scanning the tree-line. Then, from the shadows, came a low growl. It was the same deep, guttural sound they had heard before, but this time it was closer. Much closer. Mark swallowed hard, gripping his rifle so tightly his knuckles turned white. "It's out there," he muttered. "Stay alert." For a long moment, there was silence. The growl faded into the night, and the only sound was the soft crackling of the fire. But the presence, the feeling of being watched, was stronger now. They could feel it. It was out there, circling, waiting for the right moment to strike. Tom's breath came in shaky gasps as he stared out into the darkness. "Why is it waiting?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "If it wants to kill us, why hasn't it attacked yet?" Mark didn't have an answer. He didn't know why the creature was stalking them, why it hadn't struck yet. All he knew was that they were being hunted by something far more intelligent than any predator they had ever encountered. Suddenly, from the trees, there was movement, fast, deliberate. The sound of something large crashing through the underbrush, coming toward them. "Here it comes!" John shouted, raising his rifle. Mark's heart leapt into his throat as the creature emerged from the tree-line, its red eyes glowing, its hulking form moving with terrifying speed. It charged at them, snarling, its massive antlers catching the light of the fire as it barreled forward. Mark fired, the shot ringing out through the night. The bullet hit its mark, striking the creature in the chest. Black blood sprayed from the wound, but the creature barely slowed. It roared, a sound that shook the ground beneath them, and kept coming. John and Tom fired too, their shots tearing through the night, but the creature seemed unstoppable. It twisted and moved with an unnatural speed, its red eyes fixed on them with a terrifying intelligence. "Fall back!" Mark shouted, scrambling to reload his rifle. "Get to the rocks!" But before they could move, the creature lunged. It was faster than they could have imagined, closing the distance in the blink of an eye. Mark barely had time to react before it was on them, its massive claws swiping through the air. Tom screamed as the creature's claws raked across his chest, sending him sprawling backward into the snow. Blood splattered across the white ground, and he cried out in pain, clutching his side as he tried to crawl away. "Tom!" John screamed, firing wildly at the creature. Mark didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, pulling Tom away from the beast, dragging him toward the rocks as the creature snarled and turned its attention toward them. The creature's growls reverberated through the forest, deep and primal, as it paced back and forth beyond the rocks. Its red eyes glowed like embers in the dark, watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. Mark sat with his back against the cold stone, his breath coming in ragged bursts, his mind racing. He glanced over at Tom, who was lying on the ground, clutching his chest where the creature had raked its claws. Tom's face was pale, his breath shallow and labored. Blood soaked through his jacket, staining the snow beneath him. "How bad is it?" Mark asked, his voice strained. John knelt beside his son, pressing a hand against the wound in a desperate attempt to stop the bleeding. "It's bad," he muttered, his voice thick with fear. "We need to get him out of here, or he's not gonna make it." Tom winced, his face contorted in pain. "I'm fine," he muttered weakly, though his pale complexion told a different story. He coughed, his breath shallow and uneven. Mark's heart pounded. They couldn't stay here. The creature wouldn't leave them alone, and Tom was in no condition to fight. But the thought of leaving their shelter sent a fresh wave of terror through him. The creature was fast, faster than any of them could have imagined, and it seemed to be growing more aggressive with each passing minute. "What's the plan?" John asked, his voice urgent but steady. "We can't just sit here and wait for it to finish us off." Mark swallowed hard, glancing over the top of the rocks. The creature was still pacing, its massive, twisted form barely visible in the dark. It had circled back into the shadows, using the forest as cover, but Mark knew it was watching them, waiting for one of them to slip. He looked back at John, his expression grim. "We have to move. It knows we're cornered, and the longer we stay, the worse it's going to get. We need to head toward the river, it's our best chance to lose it." "The river's a few miles out," John said, glancing down at Tom, who lay groaning softly on the ground. "He's not going to make it that far." "We don't have a choice," Mark replied, the weight of the situation heavy in his voice. "If we stay here, none of us are making it through the night." John clenched his jaw, but he nodded, knowing Mark was right. They couldn't wait for the creature to strike again. They had to make a move before it decided to attack. "All right," he said, his voice low but resolute. "Let's get him up." Together, Mark and John lifted Tom to his feet. Tom groaned in pain, his body trembling with the effort, but he managed to stay upright, leaning heavily on his father for support. Mark grabbed Tom's rifle and slung it over his shoulder, his eyes constantly scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. "Stay close," Mark whispered as they began to move, their footsteps soft in the snow. The air around them felt thick, oppressive, and every rustle of the wind through the trees made their nerves spike. "If it comes for us again, we make for the river. Don't stop." The forest was eerily quiet as they moved, the only sound the crunch of snow beneath their boots and the faint, labored breaths of Tom as they struggled to keep him moving. The shadows between the trees seemed to shift and flicker in the firelight's dim glow, and Mark couldn't shake the feeling that the forest itself was alive, bending and warping to trap them. Every few steps, Mark glanced back over his shoulder, his heart pounding in his chest. The creature was still out there, he could feel it. It was watching them, stalking them like prey. But for now, it remained hidden, waiting for them to let their guard down. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. The tension was suffocating, each second spent anticipating the creature's next move. But as they neared the edge of the trees, a faint glimmer of hope flickered in Mark's mind. Maybe, just maybe, they were putting enough distance between themselves and the creature. Then, from the darkness behind them, came the sound they had all been dreading, a low, guttural growl that sent a shiver down Mark's spine. It was close. Too close. "Go!" Mark shouted, his voice sharp with panic. "Move!" John pushed forward, dragging Tom along as fast as he could manage. Mark stayed behind, rifle raised, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The growl echoed through the trees again, louder this time, and Mark's pulse spiked. The creature was coming. Suddenly, there was a flash of movement, dark and fast, a blur of fur and antlers hurtling toward them from the shadows. Mark fired, the shot cracking through the still air. The bullet struck the creature in the shoulder, sending it stumbling back with a snarl. Black blood sprayed across the snow, but the creature barely slowed. It growled, its red eyes burning with rage as it charged again. "Go, go!" Mark shouted as he fired again, trying to buy them time. The creature roared in pain, but it didn't stop. It never stopped. Mark turned and ran, his heart racing, his legs burning with the effort. He could hear the creature crashing through the underbrush behind him, its claws tearing through the snow as it gained on them. Up ahead, he saw the river, a thin ribbon of silver in the moonlight, cutting through the forest. The sound of rushing water was faint but unmistakable. It was their only chance. Almost there. Mark shouted, pushing himself harder. "Don't stop!" John, dragging Tom, stumbled toward the riverbank, his face pale and lined with fear. They were so close. Just a few more feet. Then, with a deafening roar, the creature burst from the trees behind them. It moved faster than any of them could react, its massive form hurtling toward them with terrifying speed. Mark turned, firing wildly, but the creature dodged the shots, twisting and weaving like a predator closing in for the kill. Mark barely had time to shout a warning before the creature struck. Its claws slashed through the air, aimed directly at Tom, who was too weak to defend himself. Mark watched in horror as the creature's claws raked across Tom's back, tearing through his jacket and sending him sprawling to the ground with a cry of pain. "Tom!" John screamed, dropping to his knees beside his son. The creature snarled, its red eyes blazing as it loomed over them, its breath hot and foul in the cold night air. Mark raised his rifle again, aiming for the creature's head, but before he could fire, the creature lunged. It happened so fast. One moment, John was kneeling beside his son, and the next, the creature had him in its claws. John screamed as the creature lifted him off the ground, its claws digging into his chest. Blood sprayed across the snow, and the creature snarled, shaking John violently as if he were nothing more than a rag doll. "John!" Mark shouted, firing his rifle again and again. The bullets tore through the air, striking the creature, but it didn't stop. It didn't even flinch. With a final, bone-chilling roar, the creature hurled John's limp body into the trees. His body hit the ground with a sickening thud, disappearing into the shadows. Mark's breath came in short, ragged gasps as he stared at the creature, his heart pounding in his chest. Tom lay motionless on the ground, too weak to move, and John was gone. The creature turned its red eyes toward Mark, its body rippling with dark, unnatural energy. It growled, low and deep, as it took a step forward. Mark gritted his teeth, his hands shaking as he raised his rifle one last time. If this was how it ended, he wasn't going down without a fight. The forest was eerily quiet after the creature hurled John's body into the darkness. The only sound left was Mark's ragged breathing and the soft trickle of the nearby river. His mind was racing, his heart pounding in his chest as he stood frozen, rifle raised, staring into the glowing red eyes of the creature that had just torn his friend apart. Tom lay in the snow behind him, groaning weakly, his breath shallow and labored. He didn't have much time left. Mark knew that if he didn't do something, anything, they would both be dead within minutes. The creature took a slow, deliberate step forward, its massive claws leaving deep gouges in the snow. Its body, though battered and bleeding from the shots Mark had fired, moved with a terrifying confidence, as if the pain meant nothing to it. The black blood still oozed from its wounds, thick and unnatural, steaming as it hit the cold ground. The air around the beast seemed to hum with an otherworldly energy, making Mark's skin prickle. "Stay back!" Mark shouted, his voice shaking. He raised the rifle, aiming directly between the creature's eyes. But his hands were trembling, and he knew, deep down, that no amount of bullets would stop this thing. The creature snarled, its lips curling back to reveal sharp, jagged teeth. It seemed to sense his fear, feeding off it, growing more aggressive as it closed the distance. Mark squeezed the trigger, firing one shot, then another. Both bullets hit their mark, striking the creature in the chest, but it barely slowed. The glowing red eyes fixed on Mark, and with a guttural roar, it lunged. Mark threw himself to the side, barely avoiding the creature's claws as they slashed through the air where he had been standing. He hit the ground hard, snow flying up around him, his rifle skidding out of his grasp and disappearing into the underbrush. His heart pounded as he scrambled to his feet, his eyes darting around in a panic. He was unarmed, vulnerable. "Tom!" Mark shouted, glancing toward his fallen friend. Tom was barely conscious, his eyes fluttering open and closed as he fought to stay awake. Mark knew he couldn't leave him here, but the creature was too fast, too powerful. They were trapped. The creature turned toward Tom, its red eyes narrowing as it sniffed the air, sensing weakness. Mark's blood ran cold as the beast began stalking toward him, its claws digging into the ground, saliva dripping from its snarling jaws. "No!" Mark screamed, desperation surging through him as he ran toward Tom, placing himself between his friend and the creature. "Come after me. Leave him alone." The creature paused, tilting its head as if considering his words. For a moment, its glowing eyes seemed to study him, the intelligence behind them unsettling. Then, with a low growl, it lunged again, this time straight for Mark. Mark dove for his fallen rifle, his fingers brushing against the cold metal just as the creature's claws swiped through the air inches from his head. He rolled to his feet, rifle raised, and fired point-blank into the creature's chest. The bullet struck true, and the creature let out an enraged roar, black blood spraying across the snow. It staggered back, but its eyes never left Mark's. The wound was deep, but still, the beast didn't fall. It was relentless. Mark backed up, his legs shaking, trying to put more distance between them. He had no idea how much more punishment the creature could take, but he knew one thing for sure, they couldn't outrun it. Not now. Not like this. His mind raced, searching for a solution, a way out. Then his eyes flicked toward the river, their only chance. The current was fast, icy, and dangerous, but it was their only hope of putting some distance between them and the beast. "Tom," Mark whispered under his breath, his voice tight with fear. "We're going to the river. Now." Tom groaned weakly, his body shaking from the blood loss. He could barely stand, but Mark wasn't going to leave him behind. He grabbed Tom under the arms and hauled him to his feet, dragging him toward the rushing water as fast as he could. Behind them, the creature let out another guttural roar. It wasn't going to let them go. Mark half-dragged, half-carried Tom to the edge of the riverbank, the sound of the rushing water filling his ears. The cold, icy current churned angrily below them, but it was their only option. The creature burst from the trees, its claws gouging deep into the snow as it charged toward them with terrifying speed. Mark didn't have time to think. He grabbed Tom and threw both of them into the freezing river. The cold hit Mark like a sledgehammer, knocking the air from his lungs as the icy water engulfed them. He fought to keep his head above water, his arms struggling to hold on to Tom as the current dragged them downstream. Behind them, the creature skidded to a stop at the river's edge, snarling in frustration. It paced back and forth, its glowing red eyes tracking their movements as they were swept away by the current. For a moment, Mark thought they had escaped. But then the creature did something that made Mark's heart sink. It crouched low, as if readying itself to leap. Its muscles bunched, and with a powerful kick, it launched itself into the air, soaring across the river with terrifying agility. Mark's eyes widened in disbelief as the creature cleared the river in a single leap, landing with a deafening crash on the opposite bank, just ahead of them. It snarled, its red eyes glowing brighter, and then it lunged straight for Mark. The icy water made it impossible to move quickly, and Mark knew there was no way to avoid it this time. The creature was too close, too fast. But as the creature's claws came down toward him, something in the river shifted. The current surged suddenly, violently, pulling Mark and Tom under. The world turned cold and black, and for a few terrifying seconds, Mark couldn't breathe. The water roared in his ears, and he fought against the current, struggling to reach the surface. When he finally broke through, gasping for air, he realized the creature was gone. The current had dragged them far downstream, away from the beast. Mark looked around wildly, but there was no sign of it. They had escaped, for now. Mark clung to a rock near the riverbank, his arms burning from the effort of holding on to Tom. He dragged them both out of the water, collapsing onto the snow-covered ground, panting and shivering from the cold. Tom lay beside him, barely conscious, his breath shallow but steady. He was alive. Mark glanced up at the forest, half expecting the creature to come barreling through the trees after them. But the woods were silent now, the red eyes gone, the growls no longer echoing in the night. They were safe. For now. Mark leaned back against the cold ground, his body aching, his mind racing. The creature was still out there, somewhere, lurking in the dark. It would never stop hunting them. But they had survived, against all odds, they had survived. As he stared up at the dark sky, the stars barely visible through the mist, Mark knew one thing for certain. This forest would never let them leave. The forest may have let Mark and Tom survive the night, but something tells us that they'll never truly escape its grip. What about you? Did you feel the dread creeping in as the creature stalked them through the shadows? Did you sense the forest itself twisting and turning against them? If you enjoyed this chilling tale of terror and suspense, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Like the video if you felt the fear rising, and let us know in the comments what part of the story gripped you the most. Was it the relentless creature or the way the forest came alive? And don't forget to share this experience with your friends, because who doesn't love a good scare? Thanks for watching, and remember, sometimes the scariest things aren't just in your imagination, they're waiting in the dark, watching and waiting.